Good morning and welcome to this event entitled China Goes Green, Coercive Environmentalism for a Troubled Planet. My name is David Fields and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you've found your way to this event, it is likely that our center offers many other events and programming that might be of interest to you. So I encourage you to please visit us at eastasia.wisc.edu for details about future programming and more information. Our moderator for this event this morning is Michael Bell, who is Chair and Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of Community and Environmental Sociology at the University of Wisconsin. Professor Bell is the author of more than 8 books, the most recent of which being City of the Good, Nature, Religion, and the Ancient Search for What is Right, which was published in 2018 by Princeton University Press. Thank you very much, Michael Bell, for moderating this today.
Hey, I'm really happy for the opportunity and looking forward to a great conversation today with our 2 co-authors, Yifei Li, who is Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies at New York University, branch in Shanghai, and also with Judith Shapiro, who is chair of the Global Environmental Politics program at American University. Welcome to you both. We're in a few different time zones. So Yifei is actually in Shanghai, where I think it is, what is it, about 10 o'clock at night?
Yeah, it's about 10 o'clock at night. Thanks, Mike.
And Judith joins us from DC. So yeah, it's so great to see you both here. I did want to go mention before we go much further that a special note about Yifei, which is that in 2016 he graduated with a degree in sociology from our joint program in sociology and in community and environmental sociology here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It has been going on and doing great things since then, and connecting up with Judith in this really important book, China Goes Green, Coercive Environmentalism for a Troubled Planet. It really is making quite an impact. The book was published, I saw, I think Amazon says it was published September 1st. So it's been out less than 2 months, yet it has picked up reviews in Le Monde, and The Economist reviewed it. And actually, I noted yesterday, I don't know if the 2 of you know this, but Amazon is currently listing the book as the #1 new title in environmental studies. Well, yay! So it really is making a lot of impact. And I thought I might mention, they're going to talk about what the book is, but I thought I might mention at least a few choice phrases from various reviewers, and about which give some indication of why there's so much excitement about this book. Clearly written, comprehensive, and timely. Right, it's one reviewer. An important argument. Nuanced. Trenchant. And my favorite here, brilliantly redefines our understanding of modern Chinese governance. So I had a chance actually to visit the People's Republic of China back in 2000, and like many new visitors, I was really taken aback by all the pollution I saw, the belching smokestacks from factories in rural areas. Another thing that really sticks in my mind was the putrid waters of the Grand Canal, which was just choked with garbage. Yeah, it was actually quite shocking. And so, yeah, it really seemed that the government did not care about environmental issues. But as Yifei and Judith described, the Chinese government has taken an interest in these matters now, and it's seeking to position itself as an environmental state, seeking to create, what's the phrase, Hu Jintao's phrase, an ecological civilization. And Judith and Yifei are a little skeptical about this. So I'll turn it over to the two of you to describe your reasons for being critical of this, of how they're positioning themselves, and telling us about your wonderful and important book.
Thank you so much, Mike, for the very, very generous introduction. And I also just want to make sure that everybody sees my Wisconsin swag for today's event. This is our dedicated Wisconsin sociology mug, which I got right before I graduated from the program. It's such a great honor to be doing this event at Wisconsin through Zoom for you all. And thank you for everybody who joined. I guess we can start off the event by just telling everyone a little bit about ourselves, who we are, and how we came together to work on this book. Because Judy's engagement in China was started much earlier than mine. So Judy, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit first?
Yeah, sure. So this is me. You see, I haven't aged a bit. This is me and must have been 1979. And this girl is helping me to blend in a little better. So I was one of the very first Americans to go and teach English in China as part of the US-China People's Friendship Association right after Deng Xiaoping's Foreign Modernizations Plan was launched. And yeah, that started an entire career of involvement with China, mostly working on helping people at the grassroots get their stories out. So I've been involved with the impact of the state on China's most vulnerable throughout maybe my 40 years of working on China. So you can see I'm all ears at this point. And now to little Yifei.
Okay, so that's little Yifei and a picture of the house in which I grew up. I am a native of Shanghai. I'm now back in my hometown of Shanghai. I grew up in this great city of neon lights and was mesmerized by the dramatic changes in the city that I personally experienced growing up here. And the picture of my house is on the right of the screen. The house isn't there anymore. It was demolished in 2009 to make way for a new department store that they were building at the time. And my house is right on top of what is now the East Nanjing Road subway station on line 2 and line 10 of the city's subway system. So yeah, I've lived in this city for a long period of my life, but then moved to Wisconsin in 2009 in pursuit of my PhD degree. And I think it was Wisconsin that had such an impact on how I viewed the world. It was the bucolic landscape of the state and the various kinds of environmental materials I was learning from the great scholars in Wisconsin, including Mike Bell, that really changed my own intellectual orientation, and I ended up becoming an environmental sociologist. And I'm just so proud of my Wisconsin roots from my time there. And I think it's that training in Wisconsin that truly sensitized me to the various kinds of environmental challenges in China. And I think I'm just very fortunate to be able to collaborate with Judy on this book. It's called China Goes Green, Coercive Environmentalism for a Troubled Planet. One of the things we wanted to mention is the main impetuses for writing this book. One of the main driving forces behind this book is that Judy and I are both observing a tendency in the English language literature that seems to speculate the possibility of what they call authoritarian environmentalism. The idea being that democracies have not shown a successful track record of success when it comes to effectively tackling the environmental challenges. And some observers are looking to China, suggesting that, if democracies can't produce effective responses to the environmental challenges, maybe we could look at authoritarian political contexts and see how successful they are, and particularly how they might even be a model for the world moving forward as we continue to experience more and more environmental catastrophes. We want to test that hypothesis by closely examining the empirical evidence that we have for China. So that really is one of the main reasons for Judy and I to work together on this book. There's a second impetus for writing this book that I think Judy would like to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for the last couple of decades, I had started hearing about something called ecological migration. And that sounds like a great idea, right? What a lovely phrase. It sounds like coastal communities are deciding not to rebuild after floods and, dealing with the realities of climate change, something like that. But ecological migration in the Chinese context is a very, for you academics, James Scottish sort of state-led reordering of nomadic peoples. And the Chinese state has been trying to pacify the borderlands for centuries and centuries, but now they're using an environmental justification for doing it. So they're blaming some of these herds people for all the hooved animals that are tearing up the grasslands. And so they're forcibly settling them into towns and cities and saying that they should be grateful to the state, even though what this essentially means is they're forced to give up their identities and really who they are. So this offended me deeply as somebody who works on the environment. So using an environmental justification for political repression and for human rights abuses is something that's been bothering me very strongly. And so I wanted to explore this as well as people say, oh, look how green China is. Look, they're creating all these massive national parks. This is wonderful. And nobody loves biodiversity more than I do. But when you force people off of their native lands and force them to adopt cultures and living habits that are completely alien to them, then it's not okay. Yeah, so we explore that a bit in this book as well.
Sorry, let me reshare that slide once again. One of the main things we discuss in the book, which Mike alluded to in his introduction, is this notion of ecological civilization. And this quote from President Xi Jinping encapsulates his slogan for ecological civilization. And we wanted to point out, before we go into an overview of the book in terms of its different scales of analyses, is that a lot of people have the tendency to just dismiss this notion of ecological civilization as though it's just yet another propagandist's invention for China. And to some extent, that's true. Yes, it's propaganda. But at the same time, I think we aren't yet so ready to just dismiss it out of hand, because ecological civilization in the Chinese context, particularly as expressed in these notions of clear waters and great mountains being mountains of gold and silver by Mr. Xi, carries two very specific baggages. One is intellectual, the other is ideological. And I think it's important that we understand what ecological civilization means for China. Intellectually, ecological civilization represents Chinese Marxism, particularly in terms of its extension of the Marxist stages of development theory. The idea being that Marx articulated the evolution of human society from agricultural societies to imperialism to capitalism and then socialism towards ultimately communism. But to Chinese Marxists, That is an incomplete stages of development theory. They want to add that perhaps somewhere along the line, there is a stage that Marx has missed. And according to Chinese state-sponsored Marxists, that stage is what now China calls ecological civilization. In other words, there needs to be some green version of society in a certain transitional phase before communism is achievable. So that in a lot of ways represents a hallmark of Chinese Marxism in an intellectual development. But also there's an ideological baggage to it. China has consistently, the Chinese state in particular, been trying to brand China as this country with a rich and deep civilizational history. That without doubt is true. There was a glorious past to China's civilization, and yet that glory was brought down during what China calls the century of humiliation, in which Western imperial powers invaded China and brought China into, off the state of glorious development. Now, the Chinese state brands itself, the communist power in particular, brands itself as a sort of a state force that is capable of rejuvenating, quote unquote, China back into its former glory. And they aren't just creating any kind of renewed Chinese civilization. They're being very specific. They're suggesting that they're building a kind of ecological civilization that is in some ways quite unique, in some ways that has not been attempted in any past iterations of human civilizational attempts. So because of these very specific meanings of ecological civilization, we think it's just very important to better articulate what environmental protection actually means in the eyes of the Chinese state. But Judy would want to explain the general structure of the book a bit before we get into some of the examples.
I'm going to show, yeah. Yeah, so this is an overview of the book. Don't worry, we're not going to plow through every single section of it. But the essential structure of the book is to start on the developed eastern coast, move to the western areas, which I just talked about in terms of ecological migration, then explore China's going out policy along the so-called Green Belt and Road, and then finally explore China's extension even into outer space. We found some amazing cases of China manipulating the atmosphere on the Tibetan Plateau and even doing sort of green space exploration. And so what we're going to do for you today is give you just a couple of tastes of each of these. But what we did was we identified some typical characteristic tools that the state uses in each of these regions. Of course, those tools are used, they overlap and they're not only limited to that specific region, but particularly in the developed East Coast, these campaigns and crackdowns and setting artificial targets and modifying people's behavior. And then in the West, this kind of tendency to use what they say in Chinese, 一刀切. It means use one knife to cut everything. So for example, the tree planting campaign is, maybe Yifei will tell us, is a sort of monoculture campaign intended to achieve a certain amount of reforested area within a certain time. The green grabbing, which is an interesting concept, has a lot to do with building big dams in the name of creating a larger percentage of renewable energies by a certain date. And then ecological migration, you already know about. And then along the state's Green Belt and Road, there's a lot of soft propaganda about how all of these development projects are win-win for everybody. But in fact, there's a lot of soft power projection going on, and even an export of some of these technological tools that have enabled greater state control over individuals that are now going out into some of China's partners like the UAE or Ecuador, and some of those facial recognition technologies and so on and so forth. Yeah, and the trade game, we talk about the recycling bans and this Tibetan Plateau weather modification and these sort of green satellites and trying to mine helium-3 on the far side of the moon, in the name again of solving all of the lack of certain kinds of metals and to resolve some of the energy problems, but at the same time doing all kinds of things that the rest of the world can't see on the far side of the moon. So yeah, I think Yifei is going to give us some experience of being on the receiving end of Shanghai's recycling mandate.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the Shanghai recycling mandate came into effect in the beginning of 2019. I'm sorry, in the summer of 2019. And it's a good move on the part of the city in terms of trying to limit the amount of waste that goes into the landfill. So it has certain environmental justifications without doubt. But one of the main things we document is also how draconian that approach was. The Shanghai government essentially told all of its residents, and we're talking about a city with 24 million residents. Overnight, people were told that there are only 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon in which people are allowed to dispose of trash. And during these hours, when people bring their bags of trash to the trash can, as you can see pictured right here, different color coded, they have to go through an inspection process. A garbage inspector will go through their bags to make sure that everybody classified different types of trash according to the specific specifications of the government. Now, as you can see on the picture also, people adopted what James Scott calls weapons of the weak. They couldn't fight the state, so they just threw away the trash outside of these designated hours, right next to the trash bin, when people aren't looking, when these garbage inspectors aren't looking. Some people brought their household garbage to work so that they can dispose of them in a way without having to be inspected. And the state continues to brand this move as a success in terms of its environmental protection efforts. And yet at the same time, when I talk to various groups of people and individuals in the city of Shanghai, people are not happy. People are extremely not happy because if you miss the window of opportunity to dispose of your trash, you're essentially breaking the law. And people are blaming the environmental cause for the various kinds of intrusions into their everyday lives that really aren't necessary. And at the same time, prior to this new recycling mandate, it wasn't like there was not any recycling going on. There was an awful lot of recycling by these mom and pop operations on these flatbed tricycles. These people drive their tricycles around the city of Shanghai to gather all kinds of recyclables, and their livelihoods depended on these recyclables and the moderate income that they can generate from selling them to whoever wants to buy. And now that the government has essentially formalized the entire recycling business in the city of Shanghai, they have pushed these people who were already on the margins of the society even further into the shadows of the Chinese economy. And many of them essentially have lost their sole source of income. And in fact, the few recyclers I know who previously lived in a neighborhood that's not too far away from where I live have all left the city of Shanghai because they couldn't find an alternative employment now that they aren't allowed to pursue recycling anymore. So this is one of the many examples that we used in the book to document the kind of draconian, invasive approaches of Chinese environmental protection. But Judy will want to say something about a few of our other observations.
Yeah, so this was a great example of some of the unintended consequences of the campaigns. I want to talk to you briefly about an unintended consequence of some of this target setting that goes on. So the summer before last, there was a big set of targets that all local officials had to meet in terms of air pollution reduction. And in some towns in Henan province, when the farmers were threshing their grain, the grain would fly into the air and it would create these artificial spikes in the pollution readings. And so the local officials, who are always looking upwards for their promotions and their salary increases, it's just part of the structure of the Chinese bureaucracy, they were so afraid of not meeting their targets that they banned the use of threshing machines, which meant, of course, that these towns lost the entire harvest as a result. So another great example of how sometimes the vulnerable are swept up in the net of some kind of top-down campaign that doesn't really recognize local situations and also doesn't consult with local people as to what will and won't work. So throughout the book, actually, we find that when local people are not consulted, then these campaigns are not going to work and there's no local buy-in. And so there are sort of perverse resistances, weapons of the weak, as Yifei said. And it's quite a different story when there is consultation. And Yifei is going to tell us a sort of a positive example that then becomes a negative example. And that is the example of afforestation.
Yes, indeed. One of the main success stories of Chinese environmental rehabilitation is the restoration and rehabilitation of the Loess Plateau in the middle of the country in China. It happened in the late 1990s when the Chinese government worked very closely with a group of World Bank sponsored experts to spend, in fact, 2 full years going from village to village, trying to study people's livelihood choices and try to understand the local ecological conditions and people's recollections of what they did to the local landscapes that may have helped rehabilitation to some extent, and also what they did that may have resulted in ecological damage. And it was a group of experts that had economists, sociologists, ecologists, and all kinds of experts that worked hand in hand with community leaders in the entire Loess Plateau area. And they went from village to village, from county to county. And in 2 years, that was just the full extent of the work, was a fact-finding mission. And after that period, they came together and put together a wonderful rehabilitation plan that made ecological sense, that attended to people's livelihood choices, that was socially sustainable, that gave people a steady source of income, that was also supported by the state and various kinds of international development agencies. It just came together really well. A main part of that plan was planting different kinds of trees in the local area to form a kind of self-sustaining ecosystem. So it's sustainable ecologically, but also had certain cash crops in that ecosystem that would generate income for the people. So the initial story was an overwhelming success because of its extensive consultation with the people. But then in the Chinese government's haste to expand that success story, to scale up the success story, they somehow figured that planting trees was the most important part of the plan. So they just wanted to plant more trees all over northern China to form what now China calls the Green Great Wall. And in that haste to scale up that effort, they didn't plant the same kind of complex ecosystems along northern the Green Great Wall. They decided to pursue the same kind of tree species to create what we call monocultural artificial forests in northern China. And in the end, because they chose to plant poplar trees, which could form forests in a relatively short span of time to show, quote unquote, political success, it became more of a political show than a real ecological story altogether. And in fact, the ecological consequence has been devastating. These poplar trees have very, very deep root systems. And in the end, these poplar trees sucked up so much underground water that ended up intensifying desertification throughout the northern China plains. So that is a story in which we document a great initial success that was attributable in large part to the state's open-mindedness to consultation with its people. But ultimately, when the authoritarian imperative was just to scale up and to achieve some sort of national homogeneity, the entire plan went awry. And Judy, you might now want to say something about the similar initiatives in Western China with regard to hydropower dams.
Yeah, we're going to talk now back to the West. And I've already alluded to this, I think, but as most of you probably know, China's been building lots and lots and lots of dams, big and small, in Southwest China. which is a risky proposition anyway, because this is a very seismically active area. There's been some resistance to some of these dams, most famously the resistance to the dams on the Nu River, NU, along the Burmese border. But now with some of these commitments, and I'm sure you'll want to talk about the commitment to being carbon neutral by 2060, now with these sorts of commitments, it becomes harder and harder for local people to resist these dams, because the state can say, this is, you know, a national, it's a national commitment. We have to do this because we promised the international community that we're going to have more and more renewable energy. And so it's very hard for these people. Many of them are in very remote areas. They don't have a lot of political power. So this green grabbing that is going on, often mostly to the benefit of local officials who stand to be able to sell the hydro energy, the electrical energy. You know, it's not even necessarily anywhere near where electricity is in shortage. And yet these dams have a tremendous impact on the downriver countries, along the Mekong. All of those countries all down the way are experiencing lower and lower water flows. Vietnam is really in crisis. The Tonle Sap lake in Cambodia is sinking and drying out, and that provides livelihoods to, I think, millions. And so this hydro scheme is you know, something we pay deep attention to. It's related to a theme that we pursue in the book, which is the tendency of the state in its green agenda to be very technocratic in its search for solutions. A lot of engineers are, you know, in the Central Committee. That Three Gorges Dam was an engineer's dream, right? So I know that for me, whenever I go to China to talk about environmental issues, they find me audiences, and they're always in like environmental engineering departments, and they don't think about environmental issues as political issues or problems of you know, social will, or having winners and losers, or any of the need for civil society. And sometimes I'll go to these engineering departments and I'll tell them about the vibrant civil society green groups in China, and these lovely people who are just learning how to build better sewage plants have never even heard of Friends of Nature or the Institute for Public and Environmental Affairs, or even Greenpeace East Asia. And when I tell them about, they are, oh, I'm so excited, I'm going to sign up, right? So anyway, little diversion there, but the sense of that these environmental issues are technical issues, and they're amenable to solutions by engineers, and that the best environmental policy making is being done at, you know, Tsinghua, or, you know, the MIT of China in these science departments, is very much entrenched in China. And so similarly, just quickly, they're actually trying to modify the weather on the Tibetan Plateau. They can make these machines where you shoot silver iodide into the air, and that binds in certain ways with certain molecules, and it makes it rain, right? So they have these weather satellites that are monitoring when the monsoons come up from India, and they already have 500 of these machines in, I think, Shanghai. And they're going to expand them out to 10,000 of these machines. But anytime the monsoon comes up, bam, 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 silver iodide in the air, rain, 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 and try to counterbalance all of the glacier melt that's going on because of climate change. But you know, this, you know, when you start to engineer the weather in a region, this can have all kinds of unforeseen consequences. Silver iodide may be toxic. It may affect India's monsoons, you know. So this kind of sort of massive engineering of the atmosphere is quite worth watching, shall we say, yeah.
And before we wrap up the presentation part of today's event, I also want to highlight that in our book, we don't just have cautionary tales. We also have a number of what we consider at least success stories of Chinese environmental governance, a most prominent of which is the waste import ban that China has been pursuing in the last 2 decades, which became sort of international news at the beginning of 2019 when China effectively announced almost a total ban of recyclables that previously have all been shipped from the United States and Western Europe and Australia and Japan to China. And in fact, best available data suggests that about 45% of global plastic waste has been shipped to China between the periods of 1990 and 2019, so right before the ban came into effect. But we in fact consider the waste import ban to be a very, very significant milestone of environmental success for two main reasons. One is that it isn't a ban that came into effect overnight. The Chinese government has been pursuing various kinds of restrictions since the 1990s. And in this process, they have consistently been trying to tighten up controls by working closely with the domestic recycling industry so that the domestic recyclers have time to improve their facilities to respond to the new policies that continue to come out from the government. And at the same time, the tightening of these controls in China by the state were actively in response to international advocacy. So the Basel Action Network, which in fact is the largest international waste advocacy groups, were actually actively working with the Chinese government, the various kinds of filmmakers who document these waste processing villages, or what other people call cancer villages in China. These filmmakers have also been consulted extensively by the Chinese state, and domestic NGOs as well were very much involved in that process. So the long period of time in which the Chinese state refined and tightened up the ban, in fact, not only gave domestic actors a good amount of time to respond, but also gave the Chinese state actors a fair amount of time to themselves understand the complexity of the waste issue, so that when the ban actually amounted to a total ban at the beginning of 2019, it was a very sensible move domestically and internationally too. As soon as China announced the ban, a number of other countries, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia, announced similar pursuits. They were like, if China isn't going to take other people's garbage, why should we? And as a result, all of these primary destinations for global garbage aren't taking in large shipments of waste from developed parts of the world, to such an extent that we're seeing that the state of California or the country of New Zealand are beginning to actively encourage their citizens to reuse rather than recycle. And we think that is just a hugely beneficial move on the international stage. And that move really came together over a long period of time. It shows how success requires patience. Success requires consultation, even though it may take much longer for a good result to materialize. And Judy, now you might want to say something about our concluding remarks before we turn.
Yeah, we thought we would leave you with some takeaways. And so I think the most important takeaway is that we discovered that it's not as if the Chinese state is primarily using authoritarian means to get at environmental goals, but rather it seems as if they're using the cloak of environmental justifications to achieve some of the state authoritarian goals. So we have this little flip, which I will credit Yifei for formulating, and it confuses me every time. But that's the thing. I mean, it's not as if we're saying China's not green. There's a lot to admire. I saw the other day, it's not even in the book, that they're banning those little bottles of shampoo that are distributed in hotels, right? And that's great. Like, by all means, let's ban those little bottles of shampoo because they just end up in the ocean. Right? Nobody really needs those bottles of shampoo. But on the other hand, when the state is using these environmental goals to get much deeper controls over individuals, over territories, over entire cultures, achieving different kinds of essentially wiping out certain cultures that live within the borders, then we just have to tread very, very carefully here. And as we say, this is maybe interesting for you. Yifei and I actually kind of had we thought China Goes Green was a working title. We didn't realize that our publisher had decided that was the title. And so we felt in some ways that, this wasn't exactly reflecting what we were trying to say in the book. Our book was much more of a cautionary tale than it was a book about, yay, China's green, so, just to tread carefully here, even as the planet is in dire need of decisive policy and quick moves. Yeah.
I just want to say one quick thing, which is also part of the conclusion, is that we're making sort of a counterintuitive argument in the book, which is that the success of state-led environmentalism hinges not on a strong state, and instead, its success depends on the state's openness to non-state actors, its openness to place its state power in check with all kinds of non-state supervision from the bottom, as the Chinese political term would have it. So all of that is to say that we admire the decisiveness of the Chinese state in tackling some of these challenges. But it's just very, very important for us to recognize that the decisiveness of state intervention has to be premised on public buy-ins. It has to be premised on a solid understanding and sensitivity to diverse needs and interests of the people in what indeed is a very, very complex civilization on the planet. With that, I turn it over to Mike. And also we want to open it up to the audience. And so members of the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them through the Q&A box. We will be able to see them and we would love to interact with you.
Well, excellent. Thank you to you both. We're starting to see some questions show up, but I just wanted to mention first how marvelous it was to see the way the two of you interacted just in this presentation here. It very much reflects the book itself. I've only read the first chapter, but that first chapter it reads as one voice, and that's not easy to achieve. Judith, I know you've written many, many books, and I'm sure you can appreciate as well the struggles sometimes of working with even co-authors that you love very dearly. But this came out so well in your writing and in your presentation today. I have one question for you, then maybe
I want to just say something about the writing process. It was so wonderful working with Yifei. I couldn't believe it. We said, oh, you take the lead here, I'll take the lead there, right? So say, for example, the garbage recycling was mostly his, the afforestation was mostly his. I took the lead on some other ones. But then we worked on a Google Doc, and of course we were in different time zones the whole time. So you would go to sleep and then you'd wake up and, oh, wow, look at all this great stuff that Yifei has done. And then, vice versa. And we never disagreed. And I guess our work rhythm is very similar. We're both very fast, if you will. And so I think this was one of the least painful writing processes I've ever encountered. I mean, it was, I just so in love with writing with Yifei. So just putting that out there.
Oh, it shows in the writing, it really does. It's so nice the way you two fit together so well on this. So I've got one question for you, then maybe we'll open it up and see more going there. As I mentioned, I'd been in China myself about 20 years ago. I was part of a USAID sponsored trip on rural democratization in China. I fear we didn't have much effect. But one of the things that really struck us is they would take us from one middle level official to another in different municipalities in China. And we would ask a question and they would have these massive notebooks, the amazing record keeping. I remember asking one question once and that they answered it by bringing in a little kind of a hand truck with a stack of notebooks, which this is before computers and things then. But the thing that really struck us is, despite all the notebooks, it seemed that there was a lot of deference to middle level officials, like the local mayor, or I don't know, or some the head of some local municipality that maybe covered several cities or towns. And so that got me thinking, as I was listening to you speak, how much autonomy is there in that middle level, and whether it is possible for, when you're talking about a more, more bottom up environmentalism in China, for there also to be kind of like a middle up and a middle down, and not just top down, if you know what I mean? Because there's a lot of folks in between the very top and the bottom there, and they may have quite a bit of autonomy. And maybe you can see it in the variation in some areas of the way different policies from the top were actually carried out at the local level. And maybe are there some municipalities that are actually doing a more bottom-up approach and getting away with it, and finding it actually enables them to respond better to the top, because they actually got some collaboration, some innovation, some excitement from those at the bottom. So yeah, is there a possibility for a middle up and middle down?
That's a really, really good question, Mike. And I so appreciate sort of your efforts to try to create a more nuanced understanding of political power in China. You're absolutely right that there is a huge middle part. And that's precisely the kind of stuff I wrote about in my dissertation, which I'm hoping to turn into my second book right now. But with all of that said, I think, I wanted to just answer this question by way of giving you an example. One of the things we documented in the book was the Chinese government's attempt to switch from coal-fired power plants generated heating to natural gas-based heating sources across northern China, which is a part of the country that requires a lot of centralized district heating in the winter, almost all time, at all times during the winter. But there was a central government mandate that came out that required jurisdictions to switch from coal to natural gas in the winter of 2017-2018. It was framed as one of the most urgent requirements of that year. And it percolated down to through the chain of commands to what Mike, you described as these middle level bureaucrats across the northern China plains. And they panicked. They panicked because the mandate was framed as the most important thing that they have to do, but they don't have the resources to do. But yet they mobilized all of the resources that they can to try to comply with the central government mandate to the best of their ability. And guess what? In the end, everybody over-complied, everybody over-enforced. Now, you might think that, isn't that great that they all over-enforced in the switch from coal to natural gas? Maybe. But what it turned out to be was that when everybody enforced so much, and we're basically smashing out all of the coal-fired power plants and building new natural gas facilities all over northern China, they didn't have enough natural gas to supply to every household. So in the end, people were literally left in the cold during the winter of that year. They didn't have enough natural gas to supply. Initially, they closed all of the factories in the hopes of saving natural gas for residential use. But then they immediately realized that the over-enforcement was so dramatic across the northern China plains that they didn't even have enough for residential use. And in the end, the Ministry of Environmental Protection in China sent out 800 and some inspection teams all over China to these villages to give people free electric heaters so that people wouldn't suffer from the cold winter of northern China. So yes, middle level bureaucrats may have some leeway, they may have some control, but at the same time, what we're seeing, particularly in recent years, as the central government in China continues to tighten control across the country, is that middle level bureaucrats find themselves in this position of having to comply with central orders in ways that are perhaps even more imperative than what it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. And that has not created a kind of good environmental responses or even policy outcomes.
I have one more quick thought to add to that. There's a series of criteria that are used to evaluate performance of middle-level bureaucrats. And among those criteria is the ability to maintain social stability in your area. Now that would seem as if then there's an impetus to make people happy so they'll be stable. But actually what happens instead is often when there's a discontent, there's more of a crackdown from that middle level. And sometimes there's a great documentary, Warriors of Chogang, about a cancer village, and these people are unable to get justice at the local level. And ultimately they sort of have to make an old-fashioned appeal, a petition to Beijing to try to push down against those lower level bureaucrats who are just trying to keep that polluting factory open because they're making money from it and keep social stability. So it's not an easy job, I think, to be a middle level bureaucrat in China. And sure, there are some mayors that are very popular, but again, you get a good mayor somewhere, let's say in Dalian, he very quickly saw the protests against this new petrochemical factory. We're going to be, serious. And he said, no petrochemical factory. But then the question is, does the petrochemical factory simply move to some other place where the mayor is less nimble? Yeah. So it's a tough issue.
All right, thanks for that response. So I see a question in the chat here for you, which is Shu Wang asks, what do you think is the biggest challenge now in China? Ban the garbage to avoid pollution, and the hotel policy modifications are positive action. But what do you think is the biggest challenge?
The biggest environmental challenge that doesn't get much attention is probably soil contamination, because we hear about air pollution, water pollution, biodiversity loss, climate change, all of those, which are all super, super important. But the problem with soil contamination in China is so much agriculture and industry is right on top of itself. And so factory effluents get into the soil and then are taken up by the plants. And so we have all that problem with food security, right? Cadmium in rice and even hard metals in tea and those kinds of issues. So the trouble with soil contamination is you can't just take a dump truck and fill it up with dirt and move it somewhere, right? So that's probably the sleeper issue, I think, for the future.
Excellent. Okay. Then we have a question from Leo Chow. What do you evaluate the public? What's the public's awareness of environmental concerns in China? What extent is the Chinese public aware of environmental issues?
Can I answer that one too?
Yeah.
Okay. Your ordinary Chinese person is way more concerned about environmental issues than the ordinary American. I'll tell you that for sure. But that's because they're terrified they're going to die, right? Every morning before they go out, they check their app. They see if their kid can go out to play or not. They all have friends and neighbors, and they themselves who might have, coughing all the time or tumors, or, the lifespan of people in the more highly polluted north is 5 years shorter than those who live in the south. And the south is pretty polluted too, right? So this connection between public health and environmental degradation is very high on everyone's consciousness. Climate change is an arm's length issue for most Chinese people, right? That seems kind of removed. But the Chinese government is very aware of climate change because they're aware of the sea levels rising and the extreme weather events and the implications of melting glaciers for, short-term flooding and then long-term drought. And so, the Chinese government is farther ahead of the people on climate change. But if you ask your ordinary Chinese person, do you care about air pollution, water pollution, food safety? They're like, yes, 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 yes. This is very, very high on their list of concerns.
Yifei, did you want to speak to that one too?
No, I'm just in agreement with everything that Judy said to both of these questions. And to Leo Chow's question about awareness, I just wanted to bring in an additional piece of information. I'm working, in fact, with 2 of my students on a project in which we try to develop a computer-based algorithm to grab all data about everything that has been written in the English language about China's environment, and to create a social network analysis of who is citing whom, and what are these co-author networks, and so on and so forth. One of the things in our preliminary findings is this: the Chinese Academy of Sciences is overwhelmingly influential in this field, which basically means that everyone who wants to write anything of meaning about China's environment, they have to either collaborate with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, or they have to cite numerous pieces written by the Chinese Academy of Sciences scholars, or that they have to use the CAS databases to inform their own studies. Now, this strikes me as a very dangerous position, because environmental knowledge about China, or environmental knowledge in China, is essentially produced by a monopoly player, the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Now, you asked about awareness. Why is that relevant? I think it's incredibly relevant because even the epistemic power about environmental challenges in China are under the monopoly of a state actor. That is the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Now, the public can continue, like Judy said, have all kinds of discontents. They're experiencing all kinds of negative environmental events on a daily basis. And living in the city of Shanghai, air pollution is a daily concern, and it's a daily fact of life in this city. But the extent to which these various experiences can translate into policies is almost being blocked in that scientific knowledge process, when science is not in a field in which different voices can debate in an equitable fashion, or that different institutions are on equal footing when it comes to working with each other, or even disagreeing with each other, simply because a singular Chinese state research body is becoming a monopoly player in that field. So I think awareness itself isn't a problem. The translation of awareness into policy action has not been exactly smooth.
Thanks, Yifei. I think that's a nice segue actually to the next question here, which is from Amanda McMillan-LeCue. Hi, Amanda. You remember Amanda, of course, as
Hi, Amanda.
Same time as you at UW-Madison in the Sociology department. She asks, can you help us to imagine possible futures if you could craft one policy for state and non-state actor cooperation to manage an environmental crisis in China today? What would that one policy be?
This is, first of all, hi, Amanda, and thank you for this very, very interesting question. And I guess to answer your question, I just want to say that I don't think we need to craft one more policy or one more mandate to complement what the Chinese political canons already have, because one of the main arguments in the book is that we do not want any kind of Western style democratic institutions to be adopted by China. We're not advocating for the Chinese state to all of a sudden becoming a democratic state. All we're saying is that if China goes back to the founding of the country in 1949, the political canon at that time had a very important mechanism that China calls the political consultations mechanism. Mao made it very clear that the political consultation mechanism is so pivotally important to the Chinese political system because a one-party rule, according to Mao, could go wrong and could go too far if the one party doesn't consult enough with all other voices in the society, which is precisely why Mao made it sure that political consultations just as is the case with the one-party rule system, will go hand in hand. And all we're advocating for is that China goes back to that model, goes back to a model that has over these decades been marginalized by the Chinese state, has been overwhelmed by this fixation on one-party rule. So as long as that political canon is being followed exactly in the way that it was intended to work, and I honestly do not think that we necessarily need any new institution or any new policy design to ensure the kind of state, non-state cooperation that Amanda, you're envisioning. So that would be my answer to it, but Judy may have something to add.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would, make that for formulation makes us sound really, I don't know, almost like hardcore Maoist or something. I might not go quite that far, but I love an example from our book, which Yifei came up with. It's the story of the Black and Smelly Waters app. And this is an app you can have on your machine. And when you see some black and smelly waters, you can take a picture of it and you can upload it. And then the government will come down and they will investigate your black and smelly water. And maybe they'll do something about it. And this is an example of a kind of citizen monitoring, citizen participation, citizen science, if you will, where, the people are the eyes and ears of the government to help them to try to carry out some of these policies where they can't be everywhere at once. And, so I think that's, another positive example, if you will. And the thing is that the state tends to be afraid of these things at first. And civil society groups have to do a lot of reassuring. They have to have a lot of tea with the Public Security Bureau to tell them exactly what this is all about and what this is up to. And they have to find sponsors and allies in the central government in order to be allowed to do this kind of thing. Even if it's as innocuous as picking up trash on the beach, it takes a long time for a group to, tell the government, don't worry, we're not trying to overthrow you, So this is unfortunate, really, because ordinary citizens should be allies of the state in this effort. And they shouldn't become less free, they should become more free. And so far in recent decades, I would say we're going in the direction of less free, right? So these civil society groups are finding it harder and harder to operate rather than easier and easier. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that, Judy. Well, we've gone through the hour. Maybe I'll have one final question for you that I think you might enjoy concluding the session with, which is, as a result of doing your study, does it leave you more or less hopeful about our environmental future and China's role in it?
That's a really good question, Mike. I feel like it's a question that I'll need to digest for a little more before I can give you a fully satisfactory answer. But at this point, I think my knee-jerk reaction to your question is less. We're seeing the environment being used as a pretext for all sorts of non-environmental purposes and goals. We're seeing that in this process, people are increasingly develop a sense of animosity towards environmental officials. People are increasingly going from ethnic minorities in Western China to people of low socioeconomic status in Eastern China. They're increasingly seeing these environmental officials as people who come in and bug them, people who come in and bring more trouble to their already to their lives that's already on the margins of the Chinese economy. So yeah, that's unfortunately my take on that.
Judy, did you want to?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, I've never been, as I said in the opening, my whole life I've been chronicling what it means to be a vulnerable person in China at the hands of the state. So these findings are not different. But on the other hand, there's some hope, right? I mean, it's a good thing that China's claiming it's going to be carbon neutral by 2060. And so there's enough openness to voices like ours to see, like, how are they going to do that? And are they going to do that in some kind of heavy-handed way where people suffer along the way? Or are they going to do it in such a way that really it's good for the planet? And so we didn't talk much about the Belt and Road here, but I think the state and all these projects have adopted a very steep learning curve where they're understanding better what it means to consult with local communities, what indigenous rights are. You know, they're not there yet, but they're listening. And they always say, oh, we're new to this, you know, we have a lot to learn. And it's true, they have a lot to learn, but they're fast learners, right? So I'm not completely discouraged. I mean, I would be more discouraged if China wasn't going for carbon neutrality by 2060. You know, what if we lost both America and China on this, right? So, you know, I think we're still having a conversation. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. I do get some hope out of what I've learned from all of you. I think in part we wind up understanding better the conditions of environmental governance, and hopefully that sharpens up our analysis as scholars, and to the extent to which we can use that to help promote a more environmental and just future. So maybe you don't get more hope out of actually doing the book, but we do out of learning about your work. And thank you so much for the gift of the presentation today, or for you this evening, knowing it's evening for you. So thanks to you both, thanks to the attendees, and thanks to David and Lori for helping organize the session today, and so we can all get the benefit of your new book. And I do encourage people to go out and get a hold of it. I've ordered my copy. I've only read one chapter that was online there, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the whole, reading the whole book. And I'm really looking forward to what your future collaborations will bring. This one went so well. Do it again.
I think Yifei has a sole authored book in the oven for MIT Press. So
excellent. But the next project after that,
Okay.
Learn to Digest. Anyway, thanks to you both, and thanks to everyone today for attending the webinar.
Thank you, Mike, for moderating the event, and thank you to the Center for East Asian Studies and the Wisconsin-China Initiative for hosting us. It's just such a great honor, and on Wisconsin.
On Wisconsin.
On Wisconsin.